And so Jesus has to take a second try. And then on the second try, the man sees clearly. Now, the question is, why did Mark include this miracle? Presumably it's what happened, because Mark would not have made up an embarrassing miracle which Jesus had to take 2 tries. But Matthew and Luke both left it out, even though they were using Mark as a source. Mark chose to include this material, even though it made Jesus look like a somewhat inferior miracle worker. And Matthew and Luke thought, no, that we're trying to write a good, positive review of Jesus. So they left out that stuff. Okay. Now, all right, so we have to find a hypothesis about Mark's gospel which makes sense of why Jesus talks so no one can understand, and why Mark put in a miracle where Jesus has to take 2 tries. So let's then begin at the beginning with the opening verse. You expect the opening verse to be important, and here it is. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, God's Son. Now, all of you who remember high school English, remember you're supposed to have a verb in every sentence, and this one does not. Beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, God's Son. That means it was not the opening sentence of the gospel. Instead, it's very probable it was the original title. The original title was The Beginning of the Good News of Jesus Christ, God's Son. Our present title, The Gospel According to Mark, presupposes other gospels. And if Mark was the first gospel, then that would not have been his title. Now, this suggests that Mark is only going to tell the first part of the story, only the beginning of the gospel, that is, the Christian good news. That's interesting because the original version of Mark, before it got messed up by later writers, ended on a strange note. The angel tells the women at the tomb that Christ has risen from the dead, but the women say nothing to anyone because they are afraid. For a long time, scholars said, well, Mark couldn't have ended that way. But he did. But if you keep in mind the title was the beginning of the story, not all of it, then the omission of Christ's resurrection appearances, which the angel prophesies, go to Galilee, there they will see Jesus, makes sense. Mark told you he wasn't going to tell the whole story, only the first part. Okay? The second thing the title suggests is we should pay very much attention to the titles Christ and God's Son, or Son of God. Indeed, we might suspect that in the middle of the gospel, we'll have the first person declare that or learn that Jesus is the Christ. And at the climax of the gospel, we might have the first person declare that Jesus is God's Son. That at least would be highly coherent with the original title. Now, those passages are both strange too. Right in the middle of the gospel, end of chapter 8 in a 16-chapter book, though admittedly the chapter numbers were added 1,000 years later, but that's another matter, okay? Jesus asks the disciples who they think he is, and Peter says, "You are the Christ." Now, the reader might expect that Jesus would be very happy. After all, the opening verse was, beginning of the good news of Jesus the Christ. So that's the right answer, or at least part of the right answer. But Jesus instead responds, "Don't tell anyone that. I have to suffer." Okay? And Peter objects, takes Jesus aside and says, no. And then Jesus calls everyone together and says, no, you got to take up your cross and follow me. Okay. The first time a human being declares Jesus is God's son, it's even weirder because it doesn't happen after a great miracle, as Jesus was, say, feeding 5,000, or a great vision, like on the Transfiguration. It happens when Jesus has just been humiliated and died. So Jesus has a loud cry and expires. And then of all people, the Roman soldier says, truly this was God's son. Now, may I suggest that that's a literary thing rather than a historical one. Matthew found this quite puzzling and therefore had to figure out why a Roman soldier would have declared that Jesus was God's son when Jesus just died after a loud cry. And so Matthew added a great earthquake, which ripped open the tombs, and some of the dead came out. And then the Roman soldier said, truly, this was God's son. Matthew was trying to make this declaration reasonable. For Mark, it's theological. Okay? All right, so here's where we are so far. Here's the basic structure of the book. Peter's confession, Jesus the Christ, and Christ's response that he must suffer, is the turning point of the book, right there in the middle at the end of chapter 8 in a 16-chapter book. The centurion's confession, truly this was God's son, is the climax. Okay, we have to have a lot of material to get to Peter thinking that Jesus is the Messiah. So the first half of the book will be full of dramatic material about the greatness of Jesus. That will get us to Peter thinking, yes, you are the great king, you're the Messiah. And the second half of the book, we're going to have a lot of material to get the reader ready for Jesus to suffer and die. Okay, a lot of material about the crucifixion. What then is the primary message of the gospel on the basis of what we've seen so far? Here's my suggestion. The beginning of the gospel, that is the foundation of Christianity, the basis for the Christian message, is that we cannot rightly and truly confess that Jesus is the Messiah, the great King, God's Son, until we learn, deeply learn, that he suffered. And that has implications for our own Christian life, that we must take up our cross and follow Jesus. Now let's, as we continue this way of reading, starting with key passages, try to fill in more details. All right, so chapters 1 to 8, to get us to Peter saying, you are the Christ, are the chapters in which we have almost all of Christ's miracles in the gospel. After chapter 8, we have only 3 miracles, and they're all a little strange. Like, for example, your favorite miracle of all, the cursing of the fig tree, where Jesus is hungry. He comes up to the tree, sees no fruit on it, and Mark helpfully adds, it wasn't the season for figs, but Christ is having a bad day apparently, and he curses the tree anyway. All right, so that's another difficult passage. What in the world is that doing in Mark's gospel? And we will get there. Okay. So just before Peter's confession, we have a summary of several of Christ's miracles. Jesus reminds the disciples he fed 5,000 people, he fed 4,000 people, and then we have that very curious miracle of the 2-stage healing of the blind man, from blindness to being able to see something but not distinguish people and trees, to full sight. Okay? Then, in the second half, we're going to have to deal with the cross, and it begins with repeated predictions of Jesus on the road to Jerusalem that he will suffer. Okay? So we have 3 whole blocks of them. One in chapter 8, one in chapter 9, and one in chapter 10, and they all have the same structure. Jesus says, I'm going to be killed. And the disciples aren't enthusiastic. There's some kind of negative reaction. Okay? And then Jesus says, no, I really mean it. I'm going to die, and you need to take that seriously. Okay? Now, then in chapter 11, we enter into Jerusalem, and eventually we get to the crucifixion itself. And in terms of literary analysis, the length of a passage is very important. The longer the passage, at least in a well-written book, the more important it is to the message of the book as a whole. And it is astonishing how much of Mark relates to only 24 hours in the life of Jesus. Think about that for a moment. Chapter 14 is the longest chapter in Mark. Chapter 15 is pretty long. That only goes from Thursday night to Friday evening. 24 hours. So that means Mark thinks this is really, really, really important. The Last Supper, the arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion itself. Okay? Now, the centurion's confession, truly this was God's Son, then occurs immediately after Christ dies, and then a strange other event, which is literary, not historical. That is, that somehow the curtain of the temple got ripped in two, and Matthew worried about that too. How in the world did the temple curtain get ripped in two? So he had that happen because of the earthquake. Sounds very California, actually. But no, this is literary symbolism. Okay, all right. Now we get to a clearer notion of why Mark's gospel ended in such a weird way. The angel announces the resurrection, says the disciples will see the risen Christ, but the gospel ends with confusion and failure. The women say nothing to anyone, for they are afraid. If Mark had had a triumphant resurrection appearance, as all the other gospels do, that would have become the climax, and the focus on the cross would have been eclipsed. But because the resurrection is only announced, not narrated, then the climax is clearly the death of Jesus and the Roman centurion's confession, truly this was God's Son. Of course, later, when other gospels are written, with their climactic resurrection appearances, copyists of Mark's gospel were very disturbed by a downer ending. So they manufactured longer endings of Mark's gospel so it would end on a more positive note, be more like other gospels, and be more suitable for the proclamation of the gospel down through the centuries. Okay? But in this course, we're concerned with the original meaning of Mark's gospel, not how it was reappropriated to serve the triumphant Christian church. Now, I think a closer look at the gospel will confirm that the basic message of Mark is we cannot proclaim that Jesus is the Messiah, the great king, unless we learn that he suffered and its implications for his suffering for ourselves. We have the same message in the Transfiguration, the greatest vision of the Gospel of Mark. You may recall that Jesus takes Peter, James, and John privately up a high mountain, and there he becomes dazzling white, as no launder on earth could bleach. And then the two greatest prophets of the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah, appear. Okay. And then Peter, always as a literary feature, making mistakes, so you're supposed to learn from his errors, says, well, let's make 3 shrines, one for you, Jesus, and one for Moses, one for Elijah. And then God corrects him. A voice from heaven says, no, no. This is my beloved son, listen to him. Then the vision fades out, and Jesus says, don't tell anyone about this until I've risen from the dead. And then he repeats that he's going to have to suffer. Okay? So you cannot proclaim Jesus the Messiah, God's Son, unless you proclaim that he's the one who suffered. Okay? Now, it is, of course, true that there are many proclamations of Jesus being God's Son prior to that. But the major proclaimers are our good friends, the demons. And Jesus tells them to shut up. So way back in chapter 1, the first miracle, Jesus is confronted by a demon-possessed man, and the demon says, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And Jesus says, shut up and come out of him. Now, demons are supernatural beings, so they have access to more than human knowledge. But presumably, they're not trying to help Jesus out. So when they publicly proclaim that Jesus is God's Son, they are trying to get in the way of the success of his ministry. And the demons do this on other occasions. So later in chapter 1, we read, Jesus would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. And in chapter 3, the demons loudly proclaim that Jesus is God's Son, and Jesus reprimands them and forces them to be silent. Okay? This then has an interesting connection with Peter's confession. Peter says, you are the Christ. Jesus says, don't tell that to anyone. I have to suffer. Peter objects, and then Jesus calls him Satan. That, I think, is not figurative in Mark's gospel. Just as the demons had tempted Jesus by proclaiming that he was God's Son and getting the public to think of him as a triumphant figure, so Jesus is saying that Satan has temporarily spoken through Peter when Peter says, you are the Messiah, the great King. And Peter objects to Jesus' message, no, no, don't tell anyone that. I have to suffer. So in fact, I think Mark means that's literally true, that Satan had been speaking through Peter. And Jesus tells Peter, that's what you just did. You allowed Satan to speak through you. Okay? By contrast, after Jesus in chapters 8 through 10 has repeatedly told in private that he will have to suffer, kept telling the disciples, I'm going to have to suffer. Then in chapter 11 and following, Jesus publicly proclaims that he is Messiah, God's Son, but he does so in order to guarantee that he will have to suffer. So in chapter 11, Jesus orchestrates a triumphal entrance. He has disciples go and get a colt. He rides into town as the crowd of his disciples is proclaiming, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. They are proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus then goes to the temple with his royal authority and interrupts worship and condemns the temple. And at that point, we read, the authorities now are deciding to kill Jesus. But the most dramatic moment when Jesus uses his claims to get killed is at the trial. Jesus had been arrested and taken to the high priest's palace. And there are false witnesses, but they didn't get their stories straight. They don't agree. And it appears that Jesus might just get off. And the high priest says, "Aren't you going to say anything?" And Jesus remains silent. So the high priest says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, the Son of God?" And now Jesus says, "I am," and that gets him killed. The high priest says, "We don't need witnesses anymore. You yourself heard it from his own lips." And they all condemn him to be guilty of a capital crime. So in Jerusalem, Jesus reverses what he did before. Earlier, he tried to keep people from seeing him as the Messiah because it would get in the way of his mission to suffer. Then when he arrives in Jerusalem, he proclaims that he is God's son. And he does so to guarantee that he will suffer. So we're slowly building our case. To repeat, the basic message of Mark's gospel, at least in my opinion, is you cannot proclaim Jesus the Messiah, God's Son, until you proclaim that he suffered and take up your cross and follow him. Okay? Now, let's then go back and look at the passion predictions. Earlier I mentioned they all have 3 sections. Let me just read the second passion prediction because it's the shortest, and you'll see the pattern. Namely, Jesus says, "I'm going to suffer." There is a negative reaction from the disciples, and then Jesus teaches the need for humble discipleship. Okay? So now here's what we have. Okay? Verse 31. Jesus was teaching his disciples, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued which one was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." You see the pattern there very clearly. Jesus talks, "I'm going to suffer." There's a negative reaction. They didn't want to hear that, and they didn't want to ask about it. Then we discover what they're really interested in. They were interested in who was the greatest. And then Jesus says, no. Being a follower of mine is not about being the greatest. You must be last of all and servant of all. We have the same pattern in the last and longest of the passion predictions in chapter 10. Jesus is now going ahead of them to Jerusalem. Those who follow are afraid. Jesus takes the 12 aside and gives in detail a prediction of his sufferings. They'll beat him, they'll spit on him, they'll kill him. Okay? Then James and John come forward and want to have the best seats in the kingdom. "Let us sit on your right hand and left in your glory." The 10 are angry, presumably because they wanted to have the best seats in the kingdom. It just goes on and says, no, I must give my life as a ransom for many. Okay? All right. Now, let's then talk about an interesting literary parallelism between the 2 great scenes which dramatically involve Peter in the gospel. The first we talked about before, so let me just briefly summarize it. Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ. Jesus says, don't tell anyone that. I have to suffer. Peter objects. Jesus calls him Satan. Okay. Now we come to the longest scene in the gospel involving Peter, and that's at the trial of Jesus. And Mark has spliced together Peter and Jesus in this section. The high priest asks Jesus, are you the Christ? Jesus says, I am, and that gets him killed. Meanwhile, Peter is below in the courtyard denying that he even knows this person. Do you see the literary reversal there? Peter says, you are the Christ. Jesus says, don't tell anyone, I have to suffer. The high priest says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, Son of God? Jesus says, you bet, and that gets him killed. Meanwhile, Peter is below, and here below is not simply spatial, it's spiritual, moral. He's at a lower level, and he's denying that he knows Jesus. Now, as we'll see in a moment, Mark loves irony. So when Peter denies that he knows Jesus, we have to ask, is that actually true? Has he never really figured out what Jesus is about? We'll come back to irony in Mark in a moment, okay? Now, let's go on to the healing of Bartimaeus. This is a major transitional passage because it's the first time in the gospel that Jesus enables someone to proclaim that he is the Christ. Okay? And the passage occupies a key literary position because it's immediately before Christ enters Jerusalem in triumph. And the crowd shout, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Okay? Now, you recall Bartimaeus is blind and he's sitting by the roadside. He hears Christ is coming and he says, have mercy on me, son of David. Son of David is a messianic title. David was the great king. The son of David is the new great king, the Messiah. Okay. Now it's the crowd, not Jesus, which tries to silence the confession. The crowd tells Bartimaeus to shut up. And Jesus does not let them do that. He says, call him. And Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? Bartimaeus says, I want to see again. So Jesus says, your faith has saved you. He gets his sight back, but he doesn't do what you expect. Jesus says, go, your faith has saved you. But Bartimaeus does not go. He follows Jesus on the way. The way to what? All of the passion predictions have the phrase, on the way. I just read you the second passion prediction, okay? Let me see if I can find it quickly. What were you discussing on the way? Or the third passion prediction, they were on the way leading up to Jerusalem. Here we might remember that the way was the earliest name for Christianity. Christian was what outsiders called the followers of Jesus. They were the people who were following the Christ. That's not what Christians call themselves. They called their faith the way, the hehodos in Greek. Okay. Therefore, the story of Bartimaeus following Jesus on the way to the cross, is, among other things, a statement that this is really what Christianity is about. The way is following Jesus on the cross, of course, culminating in the resurrection. Now let's go back to the healing of the blind man that took 2 tries. weird story that Matthew and Luke found so disturbing, they omitted it even though they were using Mark as their primary source. Just before that section, Jesus rebukes his disciples for blindness. You have eyes and do not see. You have ears and do not hear. You do not remember. Okay? That's not physical blindness. That's psychological and spiritual blindness. Okay? That alerts the reader that the healing of Bartimaeus, not Bartimaeus, but of the blind man of Bethsaida, needs to be read on two levels. Of course, it is a physical miracle. I believe it actually happened because the church would not have made up a story in which Jesus had to take two tries. Okay? But Mark is saying that's fine, but we also have to look at it spiritually. What comes next? Peter's confession. You are the Christ. Jesus saying, no, I have to suffer. Then right after that, 6 days later, probably meaning the same day of the week, we have the transfiguration, in which no less than God says, this is my beloved son, listen to him. Now I would suggest this to you. What Mark is saying is, if you believe that Christianity is about being triumphant in this world, that Jesus was the great Messiah, and you as his follower is going to share in all the perks of the kingdom, you have only partial sight. You see something. Of course, Jesus is the Messiah, but your sight is so poor that you can't distinguish between people and walking trees. Real seeing is what Jesus says at the Transfiguration. Yes, I am God's son, but I have to suffer. Don't tell anyone about me until after the resurrection, after I've died and risen from the dead. All right. So, Christianity is about following Jesus in his suffering so we can follow Jesus in his triumphant resurrection. Okay? We'll have to return to all this material in more detail because there's a lot more there, because we're going to have to talk about Jesus' attitude toward miracles. Okay. Now, hypothesis concerning Mark's basic message now explains chapters 4, 10 through 12. Just saying, well, I talk to crowds, they don't get it. I don't want them to get it, lest they should become my followers and receive forgiveness. Okay? At least in Mark's gospel, Jesus does not want the crowds to understand prior to the crucifixion, because becoming a follower of Jesus without realizing the cost of following Jesus would only lead to catastrophe. Now, 4, 10 to 12 comes immediately after the parable of the sower. You recall, there were many kinds of seed, or rather many kinds of soil. The seeds had very different results. Most of them came to nothing. The seed falling on the path, the birds ate. The seed which fell on the rock sprang up quickly but had no moisture and withered. The seed which fell among the thorns got choked out. And only the remaining seed over time had a great produce. Okay. Jesus explains the meaning of the parable to his disciples. What's the meaning? You have to endure. So what's the seed on the rock? That's interesting because it's the longest explanation. That stands for people who hear the word and are excited by it, but in time of tribulation and persecution fall away. That message isn't for the crowds yet, because that's what would happen to them. or they would get rich and abandon the faith, or whatever. Okay? It's interesting that immediately after saying, I don't want them to understand, Jesus says, well, yeah, but they will understand later. That's part of God's plan. There's nothing hidden except to be revealed, nothing hidden away except to come to light. But that's later. And then Jesus gives an ominous warning even to the disciples. Watch what you hear, because those who have will get more, and those who do not have will lose even what they have. That's the outline of what's going to happen to the disciples for the rest of the narrative. The 12 are going to blow it more and more until finally Peter denies Jesus, Judas betrays Jesus, and everybody else runs away. They have not learned that they must suffer. That cannot be learned until after the crucifixion. Okay? Now, literary criticism also helps explain, okay, the strange story of the Syrophoenician woman, not usually people's favorite passage in the gospel, okay? The first thing to note is that Mark was writing primarily for Gentiles, or at least he was writing for Gentiles as well as for Jews, because he has to keep explaining Jewish customs. My favorite is when Mark says toward the end of the gospel, the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath. For a Jew, that'd be like saying to an American, Wednesday is the day before Thursday. No Jew would need to have that explained, but a Gentile would. Okay. Now, immediately before the Syrophoenician woman, that story, Jesus insists that defilement does not come from outside, but from inside. There is nothing, food cannot defile you. There's nothing going into the mouth which defiles you. It's what comes out of the mouth which defiles you, because it comes from your heart. Translation: uncleanness is not a matter of externals, it's a matter of internals, what comes to the core of your being. So, the woman asks for a miracle. Now, as we'll see later, in Mark's gospel, faith works miracles, but miracles never produce faith. The woman asks for a miracle. Jesus tests her faith. It's not appropriate to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. But in Mark, faith is persistence in following Jesus despite obstacles. She says, poop on you, Jesus. Even the children eat the crumbs that fall from the table of the children. Jesus, having tested her faith, then works the miracle, and she shows her faith because she believes Jesus. The daughter is at home. Jesus says the demon has left your daughter. The woman leaves. She believes Jesus. Okay. So, okay. From an outward perspective, from a Jewish perspective, the woman is defiled. But from the perspective of Mark, she is made clean by her faith, which then enables the miracle to occur. Therefore, in this section, Mark is validating Gentile Christianity. So it's the opposite of what you might think. We think when Jesus insults the woman that he's attacking Gentile Christianity. But from the perspective of a literary analysis, he's enabling Gentile Christianity because Christianity is about faith when you are tested. Okay? Incidentally, John Mayer, probably the greatest scholar on the historical Jesus alive today, certainly the greatest American scholar, doesn't think the story of the Syrophoenician woman is actually historical. He thinks it's a story which was made up in the early church to talk about the validity of Gentile Christianity. Okay. Now let's go on to everyone's favorite miracle, the cursing of the fig tree. Okay. When you do a literary analysis, you discover that Mark has interspersed the history of the tree and the cleansing of the temple. In Mark's gospel, Jesus enters into Jerusalem. He looks at the temple and does nothing. He then returns to where he's staying, which is Bethany. The next day, he comes and sees the tree. He finds no fruit on it, and he curses the tree. Mark helpfully says, well, it wasn't the season for figs. So Jesus must be either totally bonkers, trying to expect the tree to have figs when it wasn't the season, or literary symbolism is occurring. Mark is saying, no, don't take this literally. It wasn't the season for figs. Then Jesus goes and has his great protest in the temple. God's house is a house of prayer for all the nations. You've made it a den of robbers, or actually bandits. Incidentally, bandit was a pejorative word for a violent Messiah. Okay. The temple is the house of prayer for all the nations, but you're making it a stronghold for Jewish revolutionaries. Okay. N.T. Wright has convinced me that's the right interpretation. Okay. All right, so Jesus has this protest in the temple. Then, the next day, the disciples see the fig tree has withered. Now, that literary structure says the temple and the tree have to be seen together. The temple has beautiful buildings, but no spiritual substance. The fig tree has lovely leaves, but no spiritual fruit. Okay. The fig tree has been cursed, but does not die immediately. It dies a day later. So Jesus pronounces judgment on the temple. And later in chapter 13, he explicitly says it will be destroyed, but it will not be destroyed right away. It will be destroyed later, and we'll see that it was destroyed when Mark was writing. Okay? How did Mark do all this? In Luke's gospel, there is also a parable about, or a story about an unfruitful tree, chapter 13. The fig tree isn't bearing fruit. It's been barren for 3 years, and the gardener wants to cut it down. The owner wants to cut it down, but the gardener says, no, let's give it one more chance, put fertilizer on it, and see what happens. Okay? I think Mark knew that story or something similar, but then did a literary number on it. Let's intersperse the death of the tree with the protest in the temple as a literary device. Okay? Now, and by inserting it was not the season for figs, he is challenging the reader to get that. Okay? Now, let me say just a few more words about irony. I guess you won't have much discussion since I can't hear you. So let me say a few words about irony. Mark likes to manipulate us, the readers, by giving us more information than the characters in the story have. And because we know more than the characters know, that invites us to pass judgment on the characters. to see the foolishness of the characters because we have inside information. So already from verse 1 of chapter 1, we know who Jesus is. We know he's the Messiah. We know he is God's Son. As the narrative unfolds, we see that Christ's words keep coming true. So, for example, he tells the disciples, go into Jerusalem, you'll find a colt tied by the door. Untie it. If anyone objects, say the Lord has need of it, and they'll send it. And they do. Okay. Or the Last Supper. Go into town. You'll see a man carrying a water jar. Follow him. There you'll find a large room. Prepare for us. Jesus predicted it. It comes to pass. Okay. But the other characters don't get it. Okay. So at the Last Supper, Jesus says, you'll all fall away. That's the way it is. Peter says, no, I would rather die with you. I will never deny you. And all the disciples chime in. But the reader knows this will not work. Christ's words will turn out to be true. Okay? The distance between the reader and the characters allows us to detect many, many ironies of Mark in Mark's gospel. Let me go on to the most extreme version. Okay? That is the mocking of Christ in chapters 14 and 15. The various tormentors, like the Roman soldiers, say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they put a crown of thorns on his head. They kneel down before him and spit on him, put a reed, a scepter in his hands, then take it out of his hands and beat him. Okay? They think that they are ridiculing Christ's obviously false claims. The reader, however, knows the claims are true. We've known that ever since chapter 1, verse 1. And that in fact, the soldiers are making Christ's reign begin because Jesus has to be crucified before he can rise from the dead and become Lord of the universe. Now, the most dense theological irony, at least in one sentence, is what the mockers say when Christ is on the cross. He saved others, himself he cannot save. That is a summary of Mark's theology. So already in chapter 10, Jesus says, he must give his life as a ransom for many. He must die in order to save others. He cannot save himself. Okay? So there, the tormentors of Jesus are actually summarizing Mark's theology. We, the readers, are supposed to get this. Of course, the characters who say that have no idea that what they're saying is the truth. Well, I don't know how I can gracefully say, please give me your questions and comments when I can't hear you. So I don't have a solution to that problem. I suppose what you could do, here we're going to have, please look at chat. Oh, I'm sorry, that's a good thing. All right, let me look at chat. I see there are no less than 9. Thank you. As you can tell, I'm technologically challenged. Okay. All right, so all I see is, Scott, you are not hearing us, so we can hear you.
So
I can hear you fine.
Suggestion would be for us to break.
If you have any questions or comments, if you put them in chat now, I will endeavor to respond.
Okay. I was going to also suggest that we could talk in small groups.
Oh, Kirsten says, one option would be for us to break into small groups and talk among ourselves. Is that true? You can hear one another?
Yes.
All right, well, in that case, I guess I will check out. But you do have well, let me, first of all, is there any, from Carol Luther to everyone. Oh, not to me, to everyone. All right, well, then I will not answer.
No, I think.
Carol, did you want me to answer that, or is that for everybody? Oh, please answer. Okay. I don't think that Mark has a scholastic understanding of the atonement, but certainly two things come to mind immediately. First of all, Christ's message is a message of mercy and judgment and justice, and that message leads to his own crucifixion. So there's a sense that following Jesus and working for mercy and justice will lead to suffering, and therefore it is redemptive as an example of how we must act in response to the world's ignorance and sin. The second thing is that Mark emphasizes the importance of love. The great commandments are love God with all the heart and love your neighbor as yourself, and that being willing to suffer for mercy and justice is an embodiment of God's love and an illustration of the importance of us loving others. So I think that would be at least clear from the gospel. The more scholastic interpretations of the atonement, I think, are unknown to Mark. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else you want me to talk about before you talk among yourselves? Do you understand Mark's idea of suffering as distinct from Jesus' suffering in other gospels? Well, other gospels differ among themselves, okay? I think that John's gospel is primarily addressed to the church. Love one another as I have loved you. Whereas, for example, Matthew's gospel is more addressed, and Luke's gospel are more addressed to the larger issues of social justice. For example, Matthew, as you unto the least, you did it to me. So John's gospel is primarily concerned about the Christian community's relationship to itself, whereas I think especially Luke, with its missionary emphasis, is more concerned with the church changing the world. So there are some differences, but I would suggest that in all the gospels, there's a strong sense of the importance of being willing to suffer in the name of love. So, let's see. It seems very plausible that Mark's gospel is just the beginning of the story and the rest came after the resurrection. But why would the author not want to explore the resurrection? Well, I don't have a better answer than before, which is once you have a triumphant resurrection appearance, that then becomes the climax and the center of the message, as it does in Matthew. Go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's the message. But Mark's message is, you can't really be a Christian until you learn that Christ suffered. Now, Mark does, in a limited way, explore the resurrection, because in each of the Passion predictions, we have the final climax, and on the third day, Christ will rise from the dead. Mm-hmm. But in Mark's gospel, the resurrection is primarily validation of the cross, not the triumph of the church. And I do think when you get to Matthew's gospel, we're moving in the direction of the triumph of the church. Go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I am with you always to the end of the age. That's the triumph of institutional Christianity. That's not what Mark is about. Both messages are valid, I think, but they address different situations. We'll talk about Mark's situation. This is not a course on Matthew, so. Anything else you want me to talk about? Well, I will say I think this was a triumph of you over technology. So I'm impressed that despite everything, we were able to have this session. So thank you very much for your patience. And we hope that the next class will not be bedeviled by the present problems, but many blessings upon you as you talk to one another. And thank you for at least appearing to be interested. Thank you very much. See you in a week.